You know, testing is a double-edged sword. So I said to my people, slow the testing down, please.
Amid the ongoing pandemic, U.S. President Donald Trump holds his first campaign rally. Hello, I'm Anand Naidoo, and this is The Heat. There had been talk of 1 million requests for tickets, at the very least a packed house. But when all was said and done, about 6,200 Trump supporters, many declining to wear masks, gathered at an arena in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to hear the president. Well, there's much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Rashad Richey is an editor-at-large with Rolling Out magazine and the host of radio's The Rashad Richey Morning Show. He joins us from Atlanta. With us here in Washington, D.C. is the Executive Director of Unhyphenated America.org, Christopher Harris. And joining us from the White House is my colleague, our White House correspondent, Nathan King. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Nathan, let me start with you. President Trump held that rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma. His campaign said there would be hundreds of thousands of people there. But in the end, just over 6,000 turned up, 6,200 around there. How did they get it so wrong?
This was a train wreck even from before the beginning. You'll remember that the US president really wants to get out of here and start campaigning again. That's where he can rally his base. That's where he feels the most comfortable, in front of a packed crowd who agree with him. And remember, he was talking about having 1 million people wanting to come. But then there was all that controversy, especially with the demonstrations right outside here in the White House. It was going to be on Juneteenth, on the Friday, of course, which, of course, is that celebration of the end of slavery in Texas and beyond. And then, of course, the Tulsa massacre of 1921. But they decided to go ahead. They knew that it was going to be problematic. And the fact is that even though they thought they'd sold a lot of tickets, if you looked at the crowd, you could see there weren't normal Trump supporters. They were much younger. Older people decided to stay away. Quite right. It's in the middle of a pandemic. And as you know, Oklahoma is one of the 22 states that is seeing COVID cases go up, not down. So basically, this was a disaster waiting to happen. Now, there's been a lot of finger-pointing since then. In fact, even before the U.S. president took the stage, the White House put out a release saying it was the media scaring people away and protesters stopping Trump fans from wanting to come in. They had to close down an outside overfill arena because very few turned up. And it was obvious from the cameras inside that there was going to be a low attendance. But even after that, the White House disputed the fire marshal's figures, which you just quoted, 6,200 turning up. And they said it was at least double that as well. And then there's the speech itself. I mean, no mention of George Floyd, no mention of Juneteenth, no mention of the Tulsa massacre of 1921. And it was a weak stump speeches. Yeah, I know the media have had fun filming the empty seats, but there was actual yawning as well. So the mojo for US President Trump is not back, that's for sure.
Right, Rashad Richey, I want to talk about one of those issues that Nathan just raised. You know, at that rally, President Trump said that he had done a lot more for African Americans in the United States than his likely opponent in the November election, Joe Biden. Let's listen to part of what President Trump had to say.
America should not take lectures on racial justice from Joe Biden, Sleepy Joe. A man who praised and partnered with segregationists, shipped millions of black American jobs overseas. Virtually every policy that has hurt black Americans for half a century, Joe Biden has supported or enacted. I've done more for the black community in 4 years than Joe Biden has done in 47 years.
Rashad, listening to the president there, does he have a point?
No, he has rhetoric, propaganda, innuendo. No points here. So let's go line by line. When he says he's done more for African Americans than any other president or Joe Biden, whoever he compares himself to, let's look at the actual numbers. Unemployment with African Americans based on the U6 rating system, not the U3 rating system that he continues to use. Unemployment with African Americans still remains higher than any other class in the United States of America. In addition to that, under the presidency of Trump exclusively, the gap between how African Americans earn in the workplace has started to increase in comparison to their white counterparts doing the same jobs. That number was actually decreasing under Obama. That number has now increased under President Trump. And let's look at mass incarceration. While he talks about his one program, which I give him credit for, mass incarceration overall has actually increased for African Americans under the Trump administration and not decreased. Household median income for African Americans has decreased in the United States, not increased. So he has numbers that are contrary to the rhetoric and propaganda, and that is why he rarely offers real numbers when he touts his success within the African American ranks.
Christopher Harris, what are your views on what the president had to say? And also, given the very poor turnout in Tulsa, Oklahoma, should the Trump campaign be worried?
Well, first of all, the Trump campaign has no reason to be worried about what's going to happen, because the majority of the people who are going to vote for him, like you said, there's a lot of people who are older. They will show up to vote at the polls. They're solidly for President Trump. They're not going to be disaffected or disenchanted by any of the things you see that have been taking place right now. As far as like the support for his voters, I mean, as far as the job numbers, that's nothing to be worried about either, because we're already going to see this huge increase when all this stuff from COVID starts to die down. I know they're saying there's going to be another hit from COVID. I don't think that's going to happen, at least nowhere near to the extent that they said it will happen before. But people are getting sick and tired of being told by the media all day, every day, that disaster is going to come. And they're going to show up at the polls. So, I mean, there's nothing really for the president to worry about.
Christopher, but the numbers are going up. You know, if you look at COVID infections in the country, they are going up. We had two of the highest days just over Saturday and Sunday.
Well, they're going up, obviously, because the number of people being tested has gone up. So, of course, you're going to see a larger increase. But here's the thing. There's no proof to show that the morbidity rate of COVID is anywhere near as high as everybody says, or like they told us that it was. And everybody's starting to realize that when you're out in the streets, you'll see people and they're like, you know what, I'm going to go out and live my life. And the president's touching on that. He's saying, hey, we need to get the economy back moving, because the reality is the people who were most affected by all of his policies, contrary to what Rashad was saying, blacks, Hispanics, minorities in general, women in particular, they're the ones who benefited the most under the Trump policies, the Trump economy. And guess what? As the media and the left plays up all this fear-mongering, they're trying to disaffect, they're trying to disenchant those very same minorities, because they realize that if the economy continues to grow like they said it is, that those are the people who are going to benefit the most, and those are the ones who are going to be the leaners who will go ahead and say, hey, you know what, my pockets are actually benefiting from what President Trump's doing.
Okay,
they're going to go onto the ballot, and they're going to go ahead and pull the lever for President Trump. They won't tell you that, just like they didn't tell people that in 2016.
All right, let me get a very quick response from Rashad on that. Rashad, is this fear-mongering?
No, it's not fear-mongering. It's called facts, and they're just afraid of facts, and that's the fear-mongering, because they run away from them. Let's be very clear. The President of the United States never won the heart and mind of the American voter. Why? Because 3 million more people literally voted for his challenger than voted for him. So if you're saying that somehow the overwhelming majority of Americans agree with him, they don't.
Aliens who voted, right? That in California, you take out all the illegal aliens who voted in California.
You have got.
Boom,
where did you get this guy from? Are you guys serious?
Are you seriously going to sit there and act like illegal aliens are not voting? Are you going to sit here and lie to everyone and say,
can you show me the proof?
All right, let's let our correspondent get in on this discussion. Lathan, go ahead.
Look, I can understand why everyone's heated, but facts are facts, right? And we had Christopher talking about how African Americans have been benefiting from a booming economy. That is true. Though also our other guest, Rashid, is very true that not in the same proportion, especially of richer white Americans. But COVID has disproportionately decimated communities of color. And, you know, along with obviously the horrible killing of George Floyd, this is something that has really hit the president. The president's numbers are terrible. Even his own campaign are seeing that elderly voters, because of the response to COVID, are abandoning him. You know, they accuse Joe Biden of sitting in his basement. That's fine. But if Joe Biden sits in his basement, he's going to win, because he's up in every swing state he needs, and some states like Texas are even swinging. So what I'm saying,
Christopher,
is that the same polls that you use?
Right, Christopher. Let me get to some of those. Christopher, let me get to some of those numbers that Nathan was talking about. If we look at the Democrat nominee, the likely nominee, Joe Biden, he's outperforming Trump in at least a dozen key swing states. He's ahead by 26 points among women. Biden is also taking away support from Trump among white, non-college educated voters. It slipped by 10 points.
So was Hillary in 2016. All those things that you're saying right now are the exact same things that people like you were saying at the same point in time in 2016. As a matter of fact, right up until what? The election day 2016, everyone was saying the exact same thing. I did election night coverage for Turkish radio and television, and all the pundits, all the people from the Progressive Policy Institute, all those same people were sitting there going, oh, yeah, Hillary's going to win by a landslide. How did you get it so wrong?
Well, she did win 3 million more votes, didn't she?
No,
can I just say?
Listen,
in
the United States of America, we work by the Electoral College.
Right.
Yeah.
Popular vote is not how we elect the president.
Yeah. Okay, Rashad, go ahead.
Sorry. So let me opine on that point. You're right. In the United States of America, we do utilize an electoral college system, which basically creates a buffer between true democracy and the presidential election. But here's the difference between Hillary Clinton's numbers. Sarah, allow me to finish. I know you're afraid of these facts, but you're going to get them. The difference between Joe Biden's numbers and Hillary Clinton's during the same place in the campaign is the fact that Joe Biden is actually leading beyond the margin of error in key swing states where Hillary Clinton never was leading beyond the margin of error. That is a distinction in the national polling that is different from the Hillary Clinton candidacy.
So, Rashad, are you willing to bet your life on those polls?
I won't bet my life on any damn polls, sir. I'm a political analyst. Why would I bet my life on a poll?
And people like you were wrong in everything in 2016.
Okay.
People like you told everybody,
let me
landslide.
All right, gentlemen, let me get Nathan back into this.
Guys, I think we can settle this 2016 thing right now.
Yeah.
Because let's not look at 2016. Let's look at 2018. It's nearer where we are, and it's a good indication of how people might turn out in this current election.
Off your elections are not.
Excuse me. Can I just finish my point? Okay. You will agree with me that all elections are based on congressional districting, right? So I think we can go from there. We saw the biggest swing to Democrats since 1972. Okay? They now control the House. They won 40 seats. Where did they win those seats? They won them in the middle of the country, while the country was doing extremely well economically. We now have COVID. We now have an economic collapse. We now have protests rocking every city and calls for police reform, not from the African-American community, but from the entire United States overwhelmingly. The electoral map has changed for the US president in the last 3 months. He thinks he can go back to campaigning. Tulsa showed him something very true on Saturday. He is losing in public opinion, and he needs to do something about it. Now, the economy may recover, but it's never going to get back to where it was 6 months to 9 months ago.
Okay, let's get Christopher's view on that. Christopher, go ahead.
Well, first of all, to say that it's never going to... There were people who had, like, Nobel Prizes in economics who said that the economy was going to collapse if President Trump got elected. And what? But hold on, where is the economy? Where did the Dow go up to? See, it's all the so-called experts who sit there and say, "Oh, I know everything." You're reading the tea leaves, and your tea leaves are wrong. Your tea leaves are more like marijuana leaves, is what you're reading, because you've been wrong.
Death of expertise. No one can have an opinion. Yeah.
Okay,
you can have an opinion all day long, but the facts have not been on your side.
Facts are different from opinions. Facts are different from opinions. This White House doesn't always get
been wrong. Everything that the left has been saying has been wrong. They said the economy couldn't reach the levels they reached. It did reach those levels, and they're trying to do everything
by the way,
to suppress
the U.S. economy was in recession before COVID hit. Did you know that? And guess where those numbers came from? The federal government. So that's not true.
Okay. All right, we want to move on. Rashad, the other big political news this week, that book by former National Security Advisor John Bolton, very scathing criticism of the president. Bolton said the president was incompetent, not fit for the job, and he said this in an interview with the United States network ABC News. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
You say that you were astonished by what you saw. A president for whom getting reelected was the only thing that mattered, even if it meant endangering or weakening the nation?
Well, I think he was so focused on the reelection that longer-term considerations fell by the wayside. So if he thought he could get a photo opportunity with Kim Jong-un at the demilitarized zone in Korea, there was considerable emphasis on the photo opportunity and the press reaction to it, and little or no focus on what such meetings did for the bargaining position of the United States.
So, Rashad, how much credibility can we attach to what John Bolton is saying?
Well, significant credibility if you ask a conservative. Remember, John Bolton was one of the #1 cheerleaders for the President of the United States, and he was a well-respected conservative on national media. And as soon as he decides that, yeah, I'm going to write a book and it will be disagreeable to the president, they want to call into question his integrity. From day one, I've never questioned the integrity of John Bolton. I've always questioned his methodology, and I disagree with him on some policy issues, especially as it relates to war. But I've always believed he was a true believer. And when he first got that job, I remember saying on air, he's going to end up turning on Trump because he's going to see firsthand what everybody else has seen. His book reveals nothing new about the President of the United States, more details than usual, but we generally know that the president seeks after his own.
All right, Christopher, how much damage is this book doing to President Trump?
It'll do little or no damage. You know, people should go ahead and read Doug Weed's book, Inside Trump's White House, because in that book, they go ahead and detail the simple fact that President Obama told President Trump, in the book, it specifically says President Obama told President Trump that we will end up in a war with North Korea. And President Trump was like, no, it's not going to happen. And that's why he took the bold steps that he took to go and meet with Kim Jong-un. And guess what? We haven't had a problem with North Korea since then, have we? So you got John Bolton, who is a neocon. John Bolton is one of the people, the swamp creatures in D.C., who's wanted to move the United States towards war.
Why did Trump hire him?
The president, he brought him in to bring in another perspective. The president, like, you know, people talk about Obama and how he liked to have a team of rivals, bringing in people who don't agree with him. So the president brought in somebody who didn't agree with him and took his counsel in some regards, but he ended up not agreeing, and John Bolton became so acrimonious.
All
that
right,
he was like, okay, this person's not going to be able to be there. But the reality is, look at what the results have been with North Korea. Have we really had a problem with North Korea under the Trump presidency?
Well, we've
no,
had...
we haven't.
We've got about a minute left. I'm going to get Nathan's view on this. Nathan, go ahead.
Okay, whatever you think about the DPRK or North Korea, the charm offensive with Kim Jong-un has failed in terms of U.S. strategy. They have now continued to produce nuclear weapons, and the time of the diplomacy just has basically given the DPRK more time. Trump thought he could break the mold. I actually believe in personal diplomacy. I think it's good. Now, quickly, to John Bolton. I have known John Bolton for a very long time. I knew him when he was UN ambassador, even though he couldn't get a Senate confirmation. The president is absolutely right. John Bolton is a neocon warmonger. He still defends the war in Iraq. He wants to bomb Iran. He wanted to bomb North Korea. But the one thing I will give John Bolton is he's a meticulous note-taker, and he's a fantastic arguer. He will go into the room with adversaries and tie them in knots if you're not careful. This guy knows his stuff. And this is why this book is important, because he was always scribbling in that yellow legal pad. In fact, the president made comments about it in public.
Right.
John Bolton knows what happened inside that White House. I read the book over the weekend. It is deeply disturbing.
Well, thanks to all of you. We're going to have to leave it there. We need to take a break right now. When we come back, we'll have the latest on the coronavirus pandemic. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.
To know about China. China 24, only on CGTN.
Welcome back. On Sunday, the World Health Organization said there had been more than 183,000 new coronavirus cases in the prior 24 hours. That's the largest single-day increase on record. A dozen U.S. states also set record highs in new cases since this past Friday. Well, joining us now to talk about the pandemic is Dr. Daria Long. She's an emergency room physician at the University of Tennessee. Dr. Long, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Anand. Good to be here.
I want to start with some news that's just come out of the White House on Monday, and that is an official telling us that the federal government is working to replenish national stockpiles of medical equipment in anticipation of a possible increase in the number of infections in the fall or autumn, that's in October. What do you make of that?
I think that's a great idea. I think one of the things I've said all along, Anand, is that we have to keep our demand for healthcare underneath what our hospitals can provide. And so making sure that our hospitals have enough stock. I know that many doctors I talked to were still being rationed, for instance, in the masks. So making sure our hospitals have enough stock to handle whether it's COVID or another epidemic is a great idea.
Now, the United States reported more than 30,000 new coronavirus cases on Friday and Saturday. That's the highest daily total since May 1st. And 23 states tell us that there is an upward trend in the number of new cases. What are you seeing and what's behind these new infections?
Yeah, Anand, this is exactly right. We are seeing a rise in a number of cases. I think it's really important to look at the number of cases, but not just that. You have to look at that statistic in the context of the bigger picture. So what are we seeing in terms of hospitalizations, and what are we seeing in terms of death rates, and what are we seeing in terms of positivity? How many of the tests are we doing that are actually positive? If that number, that percentage of tests being done are positive is high, that's telling us that we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. So those are the three things we need to watch, in addition to just saying the number of cases, to give us the full context.
Right, and in terms of that, this might need a bit of explanation. The number of cases versus the number of hospitalizations, what does that mean?
So number of cases is number of people who have total diagnosis. For instance, COVID, you say the same thing for flu, number of all the people. Of all of those people who get sick, a very small percentage of them in general need to be hospitalized. So that's why it matters, because of course we care if people are getting sick, but if they're able to get sick but then get better on their own, that's not going to worry us as much as those who are getting sick and need to be hospitalized. That tells us, if that number is rising, that tells us it's not just that we're testing more. It's in fact that this disease is spreading more, and it's spreading to the more vulnerable population. That's why that hospitalization data, in addition to death rate data, but hospitalization data is really important to tell us where this is spreading and how much it is spreading.
You know, this is a crisis which needs a lot of leadership, a lot of guidance. What do you make of the response from the White House? President Trump held a rally over the weekend in Oklahoma. There was something like 6,000, just over 6,000 people there, but we didn't see many wearing masks, in fact, most not wearing masks, and not many or no social distancing at all.
Yeah, that really concerns me. Whenever I see a group of people together, Anand, I look at what they're doing. And what I say are we have to follow the 4 Ds. Density, as in how many people are there? Are they inside or are they outside? Distance, how far are they from each other? Are they able to maintain 6 feet? Duration, are you just passing by somebody for 30 seconds, or are you in the same space with them for 2 hours or more? And degree of activity. Low risk is that you're sitting there quietly. High risk is that you're singing or shouting or some higher effort. If the Ds are all high, you're in a high risk event. And that potentially is what could be a super spreader event. And that's what I'm telling people we need to avoid right now. We are not through this crisis. We need to be smart and try to avoid those high-risk events.
And I suppose the other factor that one has to take into consideration is the age of people.
Yes. So if you're going to go ahead and go to this anyways, and I'm going to say a couple of things. One, only the lower risk people should be going. Somebody who is higher risk, an older person, or they have multiple medical problems, that person's at high risk of getting severe complications from COVID. They shouldn't go. If you're still going to go, you should wear a mask to protect yourself, but especially to protect everyone around you. And when you come back from that event, again, whether it's a rally or a convention or a protest or a sports event, when you come back from that, you need to isolate yourself from somebody else who is high risk for 2 weeks to avoid spreading it. That's what's most important to keep this under control.
Right, Dr. Long, now you are in Atlanta, and both testing and hospitalizations are up in Georgia. And in Florida, the governor there says that there's been a shift to people in their 20s and 30s. In fact, there's been 3,500 new cases in Florida reported. In fact, in many of the southern states of the United States, we see an increase in the number of infections among young people. What do you make of that?
Yeah. Well, I think that's somewhat to be expected. Again, we're going to see more cases as we test more. We're going to see more cases as people start to go back to their lives. So I expect cases to rise. But again, that cases has to be within the greater context. So if it's just cases, but actually hospitalizations are lowering, then that's good. That means that that's less bad than if the hospitalizations are rising. So if it's more young people, okay, that's one thing. That means we can potentially keep it more in control. But as we're seeing in Florida and some other states, they're seeing the cases rise and the hospitalizations rise, which means we're not getting the severity of the disease under control. And that's when we risk exceeding our hospital threshold. And if we increase our capacity, if we exceed our capacity, that's when we get to those scary situations where you can't take care of everybody who is sick. That's what we want to avoid. And if we're strategic, if we follow the 4 Ds, we don't have to panic. We can be smart about this.
Now, there are some who've suggested that the United States is in a second wave of infections. But Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's the country's leading expert on infectious diseases, he says that with more than 20,000 infections, new infections, that is, per day, the first wave is not yet over. What do you make of that? Does he have a point?
Well, yeah, you can't call it a second wave when you haven't actually finished the first wave. So absolutely. I think to finish the first wave would mean we're getting the cases under control. We're seeing steady decreases in hospitalizations, in death rate, in percent of positive tests. We have not seen a steady decline across the entire country. We're seeing some steadiness across the entire nation if you look at the nation level. But we are seeing pockets in many states, Texas, Arizona, Florida, North and South Carolina, where they do not have it under control. And I think this is just the first wave spreading across the country. We have to get it under control first before we can even think about there being a second wave. We're still in the first.
Okay, I have a little bit of time left, and I want to talk about treatments. Oxford University scientists are saying that they have a steroid-based medication known as dexamethasone, which has been effective in reducing the number of infections or treating people who've been infected. What can you tell us about this treatment?
Yeah, so dexamethasone, it's a steroid. It's been around for ages. We use it, I as an emergency room doctor use it for a number of different indications. The trouble with this study, that's being heralded as a study, it was really a press release. So it is impossible for any of us to look at the data and see who actually got this medication, how do they do in comparison to the others. So that's great if it is able to show some mortality decrease. But I've talked to a number of different doctors about this, and a lot of them say, well, we're currently using it in our sickest patients. But this press release alone is not enough to make us change any practices. And again, this is to be used in the sickest patients in the intensive care unit, not necessarily extrapolated for everybody else. So we need to see the actual data before we can start drawing any conclusions.
Dr. Daria Long, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Anand. My pleasure.
And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidoo in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being here.